And I am DaVida Alston. This is our second episode in the Gradual Release Responsibility. It's our second episode. And thank you for joining me today for that second episode of the Embracing Change webinar series hosted by National Geographic Learning. And over the course of the last year, we really wanted to talk about embracing change. You know, there's been so much that has happened in education across the globe. And there's been this huge paradigm shift in the nature of how teachers deliver and plan their lessons to accommodate for online learning or those hybrid or blended model classrooms. So in this professional learning community, we want to ensure that we're up on current research, current trends in education, and provide you with strategies and tools and resources that you will be able to use in your classroom. So if you were with me last week, we embarked on a virtual road trip together, I called it. And we explored learning skills for students, which prepare them for a global society and develop career and college readiness skills through the 4 C's framework. This week, we're going to actually take flight, and our whole presentation will be around taking flight into embracing change. And today we'll continue our journey and we will take flight and delve into the research and practical applications of frameworks for planning and delivering quality instruction, which will ultimately lead to learning through the gradual release framework. And this session will kind of set the road for our continued journey. Today we'll work on the research, pedagogy around these 2 frameworks, and then this will lead into our next 2 sessions where we'll get into practical application as we discuss balanced literacy, and then ending the Embracing Change series with inclusive practices in all classrooms. So again, thank you for joining me on this exciting journey. For those of you that are new, I'm DaVida Alston. And I have been with National Geographic Learning since the beginning of the year, but I'm also an educator by trade. I've been an educator for over 25 years, and I've held positions inclusive of classroom teacher, district level support for reading and special education. I've also been a district leader in the United States, leading schools in special education across different states and school districts. And I've been a school leader here in the GCC region. And my expertise includes special education, working with English language learners, as well as a core expertise in reading and strategies to produce positive outcomes for students who struggle with reading. And so I truly believe in transformational leadership. It's building capacity. So I love professional development and to build capacity among teachers so that we can make positive outcomes for students. So thank you for joining me. I'll be your pilot for today, but every great pilot has to have a great co-pilot. And so I bring with me, I'm so excited to have Dr. Sherry Miller join me today. I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Miller in the UAE, and she just brings a host of expertise. So Dr. Miller is a career educator with 30 years of K12 experience in schools. She has served at all levels of school organization, inclusive of teacher, district reader trainer, director of academic services, a principal, senior education executive, and superintendent in regions of schools, having led over 150 schools across 13 states in the United States and in the UAE. And Dr. Sherry is a visionary education and business professional with outstanding qualifications in educational leadership, professional development design, coaching methodologies, academic and cultural systems improvements, and is deeply passionate about evaluating student performance. She has an extraordinary education and management background with a documented record of leadership success, business and operational performance, management, as well known for her genuine desire to invest in the professionals that she leads. She believes relationships with those she leads and coaches are central to school improvement. Dr. Sherry is an influential leader with an intrinsic talent for conceptualizing and communication, vision, training, consensus, and cohesion building for achievement of common goals. She is a published researcher focused on improving urban schools and specializes in school leadership and teacher development, American school design, and improving the impact teachers have on school performance at the point of the classroom every day. And Dr. Sherry is also the founder and chief executive officer of Transcendence Educational Partners USA and Transcendence Educational Services in the UAE. And Transcendence is an educational consulting firm focused on building capacities in school leaders and teachers through targeted professional development and coaching systems. And Transcendence is a national, international brand serving schools in the United States and the United Arab Emirates with a laser-like focus on improving schools by evaluating the practice and performance of those adults working with children. Dr. Sherry specializes in leading turnaround and transformation of schools. We'll really be talking about that turnaround when we look at instructional improvement, and is equally as intentional about sharing her expertise and gifts with campus leaders and teachers in the most challenging schools, recognizing that in the absence of improved schools, creating competitive, well-educated citizens across the world, communities will falter. So I'm just excited to have Dr. Sherry with me today. Hi, Dr. Sherry.
Morning, Miss DaVida. So happy to be here. So happy to be here with you.
Great. And you know, we say we're taking flight because Dr. Sherry is joining me from Houston. So it's very early in the morning there, I believe.
It is. It is good. And I'd like to give everyone a warm welcome and say good morning, educators, educational leaders, school owners, and anyone else who's passionate about educating children all over the globe. It is such a pleasure to have each of you with us today. I greet you with great enthusiasm and excitement for the session that we're about to embark upon and this exciting journey. Because I truly believe, as Ms. DaVida talked about, that there is power found in delivering explicit instruction to kids each and every day across the globe. Because we need to recognize as educators that it is only when the children we serve are educated well that they go on to be amazing citizens who contribute to the world in which we live in. So I am just elated to be here with you this morning. So Ms. DaVida talked a little bit about me and where I'm from, and I want to think about the power that comes by way of global professional development sessions such as the one that National Geographic has afforded me the opportunity to be a part of. There's synergy found there. And we call that this community of practice, or this professional learning community, so to speak. Now, I'm honored to serve as the co-pilot of today's session, having the privilege to engage alongside all of you from all over the world. Now, this is going to be a highly interactive session, and we're going to use all the wonders of technology that we are afforded, just as you've been doing in your classrooms, as we deal with, the fallout of the global pandemic. Now, this means you'll see us busy working with the tools. We'll be chatting with you, interacting with you. We'd love for you to give us the same energy back as we co-create this wonderful dynamic session today. Now, to provide greater context around the work that we'll do together today, we love to start by getting to know a little bit about who's in the space in which we're functioning today. So I'll start. I am currently sitting in the United States in Houston, Texas. Now, there's a globe on your screen today, and using the chat feature, some of you have already been using it, and we appreciate that so much. We'd like for you to go into the chat and simply send everyone a good morning. Let us feel your energy and tell us the country that you're joining us from. We'll take about a minute, 30 seconds to do that.
I already see Kuwait coming in.
Welcome.
The Philippines, wow.
Yes. Bahrain. Welcome. Cape Town, South Africa, welcome. Abu Dhabi. Wow, look at the power, Ms. DaVida, in all of these countries being represented. Philippines. Saudi Arabia, welcome.
Welcome.
Wonderful. So happy to have all of you. Wonderful. Wonderful. I love the fact that we have lots of people from the same country too. There's synergy.
Yes.
Thank you all, and we'll come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Welcome back. Glad to have you back. And what a privilege it is to have the opportunity to engage with so many of you from so many different places. Thank you for allowing us to lead the way as we pilot and co-pilot you to the delivery of explicit instruction in your classrooms. So I'll turn it back over to Ms. DaVida for a second.
Wonderful. So as we just get to know a little bit about you, and this will help us to inform our instruction for today, know when we may need to make some shifts, because we're going to be talking about instructional planning. And that's what a great planner does. Even when you're working with your students, you may need to make some shifts in your instruction. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll, and this will just get us to know a little bit about your knowledge about today's session, what brings you here today, what are you hoping to get out of this session as well. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if everyone can just answer these quick 5 questions. If you joined me last week, you'll know that I'll throw in one that kind of lends to our discussion in our virtual road trip. So we'll give everyone about a minute just to start answering the questions in the poll. You know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar you are with understanding by design, that instructional planning, that planning piece, how teachers plan their instruction. Okay. Great, and I see some people participating. Good job, great job. And so for some, I see that this may be a new topic. So we're hoping that you'll be able to glean from this session practical features that you can take back to your classroom to help you with your planning, to make sure that your planning is really based on desired outcomes and help to promote understanding and learning of students. And then that gradual release of responsibility. I have some people that are saying they're very knowledgeable. Some also, this is something new, a novel context for them. So we're really hoping that what we will discuss today, you'll be able to take the research and some of the practical application and use it in your classroom. And then the next 2 sessions will be providing even more practical application that you can use with gradual release of responsibility and reading, and as well as overall inclusive practices. Let me just see. I love to see. And then some of you are hoping to gain more in-depth knowledge about instructional planning and delivery, practical instructional strategies. So that one is now leading. 56% of participants would like to be able to take away practical strategies. And I always love this one, the last one, to become a part and active member of a professional learning community. And that's what we're trying to build with this Embracing Change series, many other things at National Geographic Learning that we'll be doing in the region to really build a professional learning community where we're sharing ideas, and also where teachers can share ideas with us so that we can have a broad context of learning throughout the region. And it's great to see such a mix of educators, principals, and coordinators on board with us today. And I'm saying on board because remember, we are taking flight today, and teachers from various disciplines as well. And this is my favorite because we're on this virtual road trip together. We're taking flight, and many of us haven't been able to travel over the course of the year. So I threw in a fun question. Just if you could go anywhere, what destination would it be if you could fly anywhere? And we just picked a few places, including where I am now in Dubai. So if you could come visit me as well. And then the US, and people want to go to Paris and Greece. I love to see this, the Fiji Islands. Okay, great. That's one of the places I would like to visit. So we just wanted to get you guys actively engaged. We don't want to make a session where you're just listening to both of us, that you are able to share your responses as well. Okay, and I think I have about 65% have participated in the poll. I give it about 30 seconds and then we'll move on so that we're able to maximize our time. These are great to see. Wonderful. And again, leading is really taking away those practical strategies. So we're hoping that you will be able to walk away with practical strategies to use in your lesson planning as well as how you deliver instruction. Okay, so I am going to stop the poll. Thank you for those who participated. Thank you for being actively engaged in today's session. And we are now going to take flight. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Ms. DaVida. You know, when we think about taking flight and we think about planning a trip abroad, there are steps we take to get to our desired destination. We've all traveled somewhere, I'm sure. We purchase the airline ticket, we pack our luggage, we navigate the check-in protocols through security and all of those things. We board the plane and we trust that the experts in the cockpit know and have a plan of how they're going to get us to our desired destination. Doing so comes by way of what pilots and those in the airline industry call a flight plan. They have a plan of action on how they're going to get us there, and they use that in conjunction with these critical steps that pilots take, flight crew take, even us as passengers take as we're traveling wherever we're trying to go. That requires responsibility on all members of those involved or engaged in any part of that flight. Similar to that flight plan, teachers must have the capacity to leverage proven instructional frameworks to ensure that students reach mastery of grade level standards driven by the intersection of what we're going to talk about today between the teacher and the student, and a well-developed plan and delivery of instruction that gets us to exactly the desired destination. Getting students to that grade level mastery begins with clarity of the instructional vision inside the classroom, grounded by a well-developed plan inclusive of the targeted place you want your students to get to by the end of a lesson. Only then, when you pair that with resources, materials, and checkpoints along the way, can you ensure that your students will get there. So we're now going to talk about the critical nature of what Ms. DaVida is going to talk about, the pre-work that happens, the planning, and then I'm going to come back to you and I'll be talking about how to actually lift off and take flight as you stand in front of your students and introduce the education or the instruction that is going to be explicit, concrete, direct, measurable, and actionable. So let's take our flight, Ms. DaVida. So if we think about this whole notion of learning and how we get kids there, when you're boarding your flight to travel to your destination, the flight plan the pilot uses, as I said, helps us to get there safely. Think about getting there safely and you're wanting your kids to reach their desired destination. The model that you see in front of you on the screen is a model that grounds the gradual release of responsibility framework. And it's really about this whole notion of what learning looks like, sounds like, and feels like in the classroom at the point of instruction. So this model will ground or drive our entire flight experience today. Now, it is based on 4 core elements that I just want to tag for you really quickly, and you'll hear me tie them back a little bit later in our conversation. So the first part of the lesson or the model of strong learning for kids is active experimentation. And these are in no rhyme, no reason, no order. Now, as part of the learning process, students must have multiple opportunities to engage in practice or application of the skill or the concept that's been introduced. Students must also have the opportunity to learn while doing. They must be deeply involved and engaged in attempting to, trying out, exploring the opportunities you've presented them with. That's called active experimentation. Also, during the learning process, kids must have this concrete action-oriented behaviors. They must emit those, produce those, where they're actually engaging at a deep level in learning. So often in many classrooms, we see students being left to grapple with the nuances of taking on a new skill. It's challenging, it's gnarly, it's something they've never experienced before. And our responsibility as educators is to engage them at a deep level such that we support them enough that they can grapple navigate, experience it with some supports, and gradually we begin to scaffold them away from our doing the heavy lifting. The next phase of this cycle is reflective observation. I love that one because it's really about during the active application of learning that kids are engaged in, the teacher ensures that there's opportunities for kids to make sense of what they're experiencing, what they're learning with some support. But also, when we think about us as learners, even today, there are some people who, as I look at the poll, this is new knowledge to them. They've never experienced or heard of this model that we're talking about today. And so kids too need that support, but they also need time to reflect on what they've learned through practice, through talking with partners, group work, and all the things you're going to hear Ms. DaVida and I share with you. And finally, even we as adults, when we're learning, we want to make sure that the art of these abstract concepts that kids are engaged in can be defined in this mental process that kids go from it being fuzzy, not clear. Maybe they latch on to some prior knowledge or activate their knowledge is activated through how you grab them with your focus instruction. But also we wanted to go from fuzzy to being very specific and very clear. And that is where we get into the abstract conceptualization. So now that the basis of the flight plan is set, we are now ready to continue our journey. And Ms. DaVida is going to pick us up here.
Okay, so I'm really going to move into the two whole constructs that we're going to talk about today. One, I will focus on strong instructional planning. So in order to get to the gradual release framework, teachers have to have strong instructional planning in place. They have to have key details that are in place in order for students to be independent learners. How do we do this? So I'm going to focus there, and then I'll be turning it over to Dr. Miller, and she will focus on that explicit delivery of instruction, which ultimately leads to that transfer of skills to independent learning. So that's going to be kind of our roadmap as we continue through here. So last week during our first episode, for those of you who joined me, we discussed the 4 C's and developing learning skills for students, which promote critical thinking, that creativity and innovation, collaboration and communication. And we discussed how that will ultimately prepare students for global society, building active learning, being independent learners. But what we didn't focus on was the how. You know, I gave you all of those great learning skills that you should see, but how do you build that understanding? Or how do you build learning for students? So this week's focus is an excellent bridge between the principles of 4C and then gathered into these 2 frameworks of developing instruction, and then how do we implement that instruction in the classroom? So, you know, before we're able to tackle this, we should be able to look at how to develop quality plans, those unit plans, to think of those big ideas. And that's what's grounded in the research of understanding by design. So first, I'm going to just start with what are these 7 tenets of understanding by design. So first, learning is enhanced when teachers think purposefully. You know, Dr. Miller talked about having that flight plan, being very purposeful. If you set flight, you have to have a plan. It's the same thing with your lesson planning. It should be very purposeful about curricular planning. The UBD frameworks helps this process without offering a rigorous progress. It's really 3 simple stages that really helps to have key, purposeful, and direct planning. The second tenet looks at, it helps focus curriculum and teaching on the development of deepening of understanding. And this is so important, developing students' understanding. When we talk about 4 C's and those learning skills, students have to have a deep understanding of the curriculum that you're providing them to be able to transfer learning and effectively use those new knowledge and skills in other domains. Then the third tenet of understanding looks at understanding is revealed when students independently make sense. So this moves into that gradual release. So we start at making sure they build that deep understanding that's evident in your planning, and then how in your planning you're going to make sure that they're building some independence within the lesson. So they're making sense of transferring their learning. through authentic performance. And I talk about authentic performance, and what I mean is, can they show you that they understand? Can they do it in interpretation? Are they able to explain? Can they shift their perspective in their learning? Can they empathize and self-assess their own learning? This all helps them to build those standards of core understanding of learning. And then that fourth tenet is really planning from the backwards design. So you'll hear me talk UBD, and also I'll use words planning backwards. And often people say, what do you mean when you say planning backwards? But that's really looking at what are your end results. Where do you want to end? And that's where you start. You're starting with effective planning for long-term goals, those desired results. So looking at desired results, what evidence do you want to use? And then you develop your clear learning plan for instruction. And this process helps to avoid kind of those common problems of just treating the textbook as the curriculum. It helps you to use your resources more fluidly so that students develop a deep understanding of their learning. And let's look at that next tenet. Is teachers are coaches, they're facilitators of learning. Okay, I used a quote last week that I talked about that we just can't ensure just because we teach that students have learned. Okay, we need to become their facilitators and coach them and ground them in understanding to make sure that they're grasping on the different concepts that we're trying to teach. So teachers are coaches, they're facilitators. They're making sure students can access content and knowledge of the particular skill. They focus on what is happening for learning, not just on their teaching. And I love that. They focus on learning, not their teaching. And let's look at the next tenet. It's reviewing your units, reviewing your plans, making changes based on assessments, those checks for understanding, and that you're constantly reviewing the curriculum, reviewing your plans, that you're looking at that method and then making sure that your instruction meets those desired results that I talked about at the beginning. And then this research in understanding by design is heavily grounded in student achievement. So we want to make sure what we're doing, our lessons that we've planned, that they're grounded in progress and outcomes for students. And it's all set up by those 6 other tenets that I put there. So here's the key. And this is the key of what actually is that backwards design. So Understanding by Design framework was developed by Jay McTeague and Grant Wiggins. And it encompasses 2 key ideas: focusing on teaching and assessment, and the curriculum is designed backwards. So again, focusing on teaching and assessment, that should be your core when you're developing your lesson, and then designing your curriculum backwards by looking at your assessments. What out products do you want your students to provide? What are those performance tasks? And teachers start with the end in mind by that explicitly outlining what they want students to learn using those targeted assessments. So a key concept in UBD framework is the alignment. So you see here in this slide that it's clearly aligned by just 3 key stages. Teachers first need to identify their desired results, those big ideas and their skills. Then they need to determine what is the acceptable evidence that they want students to provide, those cumulative assessment tasks or those performance tasks. And then last stage is planning learning experiences and instruction. What are those learning events? And that last stage bridges gradual release, because ultimately we want those learning stages to start where the teacher is kind of on the stage, and then it's moving into that independent level for students, what Dr. Sherry will talk about momentarily. So I want you just to think and look at these guided questions that I put here. Think about your own planning. Think about how you plan lessons. How do you do your scope and sequence? And think of it in the lens of these 4 questions. And I just want you in the chat just to talk about how do you plan. Do you think about what students should know, understand, and be able to do when you're planning? Do you think about, and this is important, what is the ultimate transfer? What skills do we want them to be able to transfer to other subjects? What are those big ideas and important understanding? And lastly, what are those essential questions? So I just want you to think about this. And in the chat, just have some conversations amongst yourselves about, do you use these guided questions when you're planning your lessons? Because remember, in order to get to gradual release, we have to make sure that we have sound instructional planning. So your lessons have to be grounded in these core principles. So I just want to see what people are saying in the chat as they think about their own lessons and what guided questions do they use. Try to simplify the lesson for them, okay? So that is a guiding principle, and that goes back to that key stage, those desired results. How do you simplify? How do you make sure that students are learning what you want them to learn, that you're not getting bogged down? And you know, the reason why this was created, because if you look at Common Core standards, there's a lot of words, a lot of language in the standards. And so this helps you, what someone just said, simplifying your lessons so that you're not bogged down in all of the extra words. You have a concrete plan of how you're going to implement your lessons. And so how to retain information in their long-term memory and use them in different situations. That's very important when I talk about stage 3. So I love that one. So let's hold that one when we get to stage 3. So this is great because this just helps you to start being grounded, not to just start teaching, not to go straight to that lesson plan, but think holistically about your unit of study and get very granular, very specific about what you want students to know. That's the way you're going to build those independent skills for them to be independent learners. Thank you for that. So the first stage is identifying those desired results. And some of you talked about, you know, simplifying. Some of you talked about, you know, looking at the big picture. This is those desired results. You know, setting your learning priorities are established by these long-term performance goals. What do we want students in the end to be able to do? That's what we want to know. What do we want them in the end to be able to do? And the bottom line goal for education is transfer, so that your desired results go back to make sure that students can transfer skills. If you were with me last week, we talked about building critical thinking. Well, in order to build critical thinking, students have to have those basic understanding, and that's based in your desired results. How do you get back to transfer? You know, the point of school, and I used to say this to my teachers, and I also said this to parents as well when I was a leader in the building, but you know, the point of school is not simply that students excel or that they get the good grades, but it's ultimately to be able to use their learning across settings so that they can be global thinkers, so that they can be innovators and entrepreneurs, those key terms that we talked about last week. And that's what you're thinking about when you're developing these desired results. So I just wanted to give you some examples of how you can really set clear transfer goals when you're doing your learning objectives to make sure that students can transfer information that they've learned to other subjects. So just look at this one in writing. This is a great transfer goal. Effectively write for various audiences to persuade and help others perform tasks. You can use that across disciplines, not just in writing or your language arts class. You can use this in science and social studies as well. So these are 3 examples of how you can create goals in your classroom so students can transfer and think independently and use their understanding across all subjects. Here's another example of how we can look at student understanding to write our essential questions. So again, when we look at our standards in our curriculum, we have to simplify this. And someone said that in the chat, simplifying. Here's an example I have here. I'll take the first one. Great literature explores universal themes of human existence and can reveal truths through fiction. So this is part of the standards. If you're familiar with standard-based learning, this is a standard. Ultimately, but what do we want students to be able to do at the end? We want them, how can they tell stories from other places and time relate to their current lives? Real world application, embedded in a performance task, and what you want them to be able to do. So those were just 2 examples. I'll go back this slide, how we can write those transfer goals, and then how we can look at basic understanding and meaning making in your lesson plan. Okay, So that second stage is determining acceptable evidence. Ultimately, I believe that this is the most important stage. This is where we really look at starting at the end in mind. And teachers should really look at, how do we know if students have achieved those desired goals? How do we know? And what type of evidence do we use? And sometimes we plan the lesson and then we think, ooh, what am I going to use? What quiz? Or am I just going to do the same unit test? Here, this charge is used first to set up what is your performance task. And we do a great job in some of our resources that we have in National Geographic Learning. You'll see the performance task at the beginning. That's because our resources are grounded in understanding by design, putting those performance tasks first so students clearly know what you would like them to produce at the end of this lesson. What do you want them to learn, and how do you want to show that they've learned it? So I say this is when, as educators, we have to think like assessors, okay? We have to determine evidence which will prove understanding took place. It may not be that test, okay? It could be a video, that students will do a video. That may be how we'll determine if understanding took place. Consider a range of assessment methods. And this is so true, especially as we're learning online, that we may have to do other things to check for understanding to make sure that learning took place. Project-based learning is a great example of this, okay? Debates, students working in small groups and then reporting out. All of those things are different ways to consider a range of assessments. So again, looking at your desired results from stage one and then developing assessments even before you get to your core lesson plan. And again, going back to, do your assessments reflect those 6 facets of understanding? So the interpretation, the being able to acquire new knowledge, using students' perspectives, so providing choice. And then stage 3, and often teaching just focuses primarily on presenting information, okay, or modeling basic skills and kind of that acquisition level. So when we're developing our lesson plans, we started with our results, we put our evidence together. Now this is how do we make sure that our lessons, they don't stay at that acquisition phase, that they move through so that students are able to transfer learning and they're able to be independent learners. So let's look at that. We start acquisition, so that's through explicit planning, making sure that students can just develop meaning making, develop their understanding. And then we want them to move through that and to be able to think critically so that they can transfer their learning. So this is just a great way to look at where we start. And when Dr. Sherry starts talking about gradual release, where we start with that teacher input and acquisition, and then we're moving through to that independence learning of transferring. And I love this. This is a great resource from NBSD. And I will put this on our website because use this as you're planning your lesson. Your lesson should encompass all of these: acquisition stage, the meaning, and the transfer. And what this resource gives you are sample student activities. If you just want to be at that beginning stage, you want students to define or calculate. This is your direct instruction where you're teaching, you're on the stage. And then it also provides you, how do you want students to demonstrate their meaning? Through critiquing or defending or explaining support. This kind of gets into that Bloom's taxonomy that I talked about last week if you were with me, that higher order thinking. And the teacher becomes the facilitator, okay? Problem-based learning. Ultimately moving to that transfer of skills where students are creating, they're innovators, they're solving problems, and the teacher is coaching them through this. So when you're developing your lesson plans, this is how it should look. You should start with that acquisition, meaning making, and moving into the transferring. And Dr. Sherry is going to really give some great examples of how that will look, the practical. This is the research behind that and how you'll be able to do that in your classroom. So I'm going to stop here, and I just want to kind of go through what we talked with your lesson planning. It should be a backwards design approach. Transfer is the goal, understanding via those big ideas, and meaningful learning, making sure learning is based on purposeful, meaning experiences. If not, Look at that other side. Students will fail to adapt. They'll fail to learn. Their learning will be fragmented. Your plans won't be aligned well, okay? So this leads into the next piece of that gradual release responsibility. Once you have a solid plan in place, how will it look in your classroom? So as we're transitioning ourselves, just chat amongst yourselves in the chat and just think about what it is, and if not, what does that mean for learning? And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Miller. And I say Dr. Miller, Dr. Sherry, we have been friends for a while, and I say both of them, all the same person. Okay, Dr. Sherry, I'll turn it over to you as people are trying to think about the Understand by Design framework.
Great, great. And as Ms. DaVida was speaking, I really enjoy watching the chat, engaging with all of you on the chat. You have some amazing thoughts and ideas about your practices. And this session only works to refine and extend and broaden that. And for those of you who are embarking upon this journey and it's new to you, we're hoping that the information you glean from the chats with professionals who are joining you, as well as Ms. DaVida and I, will help you to kind of embrace these new concepts. And so now we're about to make the shift. So imagine, back to that flight plan, that the pilots are in the cockpit. They've grounded themselves in, here are all the steps that we're going to take to ensure the safety of our passengers. So Ms. DaVida just framed kind of the work that goes in, the pre-work that I talked about earlier, to kind of get the flight ready to lift off. And so now we're taking off now, and this is going to be where your planning meets purpose and execution in your classroom. And so when we think about this whole notion of the instructional vision of a classroom, often we hear vision about the vision of the school, you know, overarching mission and vision type of work. But each classroom also brings its own instructional vision that you have with your students. And having a vision is really not a vague wish or a dream. It's actually just the opposite. It's purposeful action, real efforts that the teacher puts into each and every lesson, each and every day. Now, while vision, the word vision kind of speaks to the future tense, what we hope to realize, the information Ms. DaVida shared around UBD actually grounds and gives you the safe space to execute on that vision. Now, go with me as we now shift and embark upon the teacher moves, as I like to call them, that link the planning to the work that you do to get kids to student level mastery using the UBD model matched with the backwards design model. So let's go to our next slide here. And what I want you to know is that gradual release, essentially, you're going to hear me talk about a lot. I'm going to engage you in some graphics to show you some representations. And then I'm going to give you a view into a classroom real time so you can see gradual release in action. But there are three fundamental elements to gradual release, and they're very simple. That it is based on teacher modeling, going from teacher modeling first, to joint responsibility between teacher and student or students, and I call that shared responsibility. And then it's also going from that to total independence on the part of the students to actually own the learning. How exciting is that? I was a teacher for 8 years, and I got really excited when I was able to hand off the responsibility to my students and see them thrive in the new knowledge that they were gaining. So the structure moves from assuming that all responsibility is on the part of the teacher, I call that the heavy lifting that teachers do, to that of the kids owning their own learning. Now, the gradual release of responsibility, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think as a researcher, it's always important for educators to understand that we're not pulling, as we say in America, rabbits out of a hat, that it's grounded by years and years of theory and research around how kids learn, how they learn best, how they retain information, kind of how teachers, proximity, you've probably heard that word, and that means how you move within a lesson to support and scaffold students. And here are some of about 4 different theoretical frameworks by which Fisher and Frey developed the gradual release model. So I just wanted you to latch on to that and know that that's out there. The one thing I want you to take away, though, is that students learn best through the interplay of interactions in a classroom, not isolation. It is the codependent leading to dependent actions that we take in the classroom that matter most as students and as teachers. Now, let's go from, I want to walk you through the from approach to the to approach in our classroom. So let's take a look at some graphics that's going to quickly bring that to life for us. Now, I've visited hundreds and thousands of classrooms probably over the course of the last 30 years. And I want to introduce you to 3 types of classrooms that I often see. There are some classrooms that I call the flyby. And that means that the teacher stands in front of the students and very quickly gives them a task, gives them an assignment. They do it alone. They're totally independent. The students are carrying the weight of the learning, but they haven't been guided. They haven't been scaffolded. It's the flyby. Let's look at another one. The next one is, in some classrooms, I see what I like to call the speed release. Now, the speed release has 2 elements to it. So the teacher engages the kids in what we call focused instruction. And that's where the teacher is doing some level of work, right? Which is great. But then the teacher very quickly releases the learning to the kids. So they go from focused instruction, where the teacher is doing that heavy lifting I talked about, to being totally independent in isolation, where they do it alone. Sometimes that looks like worksheets. So I said something, now here's a worksheet, try it. Not the best approach. Let's look at another one. Then we go to the all but one approach. So take a look at this graphic. You see the focus instruction represented. That's the I do it, where the teacher is leading and setting the stage for the work. Then we see an added piece, which I love. It's where the teacher engages in this duality with kids through this guided approach, where the teacher is guiding them through the lesson or the new knowledge or the new skill or concept he or she has introduced. Love that. From there, the teacher then releases the learning to the students for the you do part of the lesson. Now, you may say, most people who think of GRR, they remember it by this association of I do, we do, you do. So you see here, everything is represented. Now, let's go and look a little deeper though. If you take a look now, we're going to chat because you know we're going to be interactive. I want you to look at this same model, but ask yourself, okay, here's what I see. I see the I do represented, the we do, and the you do. But taking a look at this graphic and recognizing that you see all of that clearly represented, go into the chat and tell us if you think there's something missing. What stage of explicit instruction is missing from this graphic? Take about 30 seconds to chat with us and tell us what you see that's missing. Someone says, I think what's missing is the time going over the answers, working out at the end of the lesson. Other thoughts? Oh, assessment, experimental examples, plenary. Great feedback. We do it together. Ooh, interesting. Feedback. Great. Thank you all for engaging at such a deep level. Love hearing your feedback. Let's look. So before I show you the final representation, I want to tag a few things for you. So there are what we call tenets of complex and responsive teaching. And there's some kind of benchmarks to that. One, there's a clear goal. This will tie nicely back to UBD with starting with results. Now, best delivery has a clear goal at the outset. Got it? Then we break it into understandable parts. And as you're planning, that's the evidence, because you know if you break it down, kids will be able to grab onto it. Thinking back to that model of learning, those are the concrete experiences kids need to be successful. Then we see that kids need to work together. They need to learn and grow from each other. That's that active experimentation I talked about when we started. And then finally, kids need to be able to take risks, and risks come through independence and interdependence, and pushing kids to those higher order thinking skills, that level of blooms that we love to talk about. That's that abstract conceptualization that we talked about. Now, with that in mind, let's look one more time at that chart. Here we are. So if you take a look, what was missing was what I like to call that but one. And one of our colleagues today hit it on the nail, that in the gradual release model, there's the focused instruction, the I do. There's the guided instruction, this interplay where the teacher is guiding students through, we do. Then right in the sweet spot, there's the best delivery happening when kids do it together. And you're going to hear me talk more and see in action why that is a powerful piece that many of our teachers, even in the best classrooms, miss that. It's only when you have the guided instruction where kids are doing it together and we do it together that kids can then be released to doing it alone. So National Geographic has done an amazing job of developing this instructional pedagogy around not only gradual release of responsibility, but a multitude of theoretical frameworks to bring them to life through their curriculum and resources and materials. But I love this chart because it totally encapsulates everything I was building us up to. So what you see here is the teacher responsibility and the student responsibility in the delivery of gradual release. There's the modeled instruction or focused instruction, as many of us talk about. That's the language we use. It's teacher-led. Then we move to guided instruction, where the teacher moves from the teacher doing all that heavy lifting to those guided discussions and activities where the teacher and the students are interdependently responsible for the work. Now, the piece that I just talked about, that sweet spot, is that independent learning, or that collaborative learning, where kids are beginning to scaffold and own more of the responsibility. Now, that looks like you do it together in the classroom. Not so much the teacher carrying it anymore, but the kids are now practicing it together. Why is this important? Because even kids need support and they learn well from each other and their peers. You're going to see that in action in just one more second. And finally, the teacher then releases the learning to the students through this independent work and tasks. We call them performance tasks that kids need to be able to do. Notice this. Every single aspect of the delivery of GRR is action-oriented on the part of the teacher as well as the students. Let's take a look closer. Now, as I train teachers and leaders and educational practitioners, one of the things I find central to that process is the pairing of the theoretical frameworks with the practical application of the new information. When I was teaching years ago and I would go to PD sessions, one of the things I would grapple with as a new teacher is, well, I understand what they said it means, but what does it look like and how do I implement it? And usually as teachers, we come to sessions wanting to leave with the strategies, the know-how. How do I go back and turnkey this in my classroom tomorrow? I'm glad you asked. Part of our flight includes allowing you to see that. Let's delve deeper. To do that, I'm going to engage you in what I call a chat and view. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put on a video that's a little over 6 minutes. And what you're going to see here is a teacher in real time in a social studies classroom where she's teaching a reading comprehension skill. As you watch, I'd like for you to join me in the chat. And I want you to capture the elements of the lesson as you observe, thinking through the following questions. What moves did you see the teacher making during this I do part of the lesson? What were the students doing while she was doing the I do? How did the teacher release the learning to students? And what did that process look like in terms of teacher behaviors and student actions or behaviors? What did you see and hear happening in the classroom? How did the we do involve the teacher interacting with the kids? And then finally, how did the teacher release the learning to students completely? And what was her role in that? So with that, let's go and chat and view, and I'll join you on the other side of the video. Miss DaVida, we're missing the sound.
So you can read along on your page with me. I'm going to read it one time through, and then I'm going to go back and think about what the facts are. Your farmstead's quite large because your father's brothers, their wives and children live with you too. Oh, so this book is pretending that I am an ancient Sumerian and explaining my life. Each family has its own living quarters. So today, when I was doing the broad strategy of the spoke diagram, I was thinking about how the text that I had chosen fits into that diagram and exactly what I want the students to be thinking about during the time that they are reading and they're applying this strategy. And the way that I ask the students to practice the strategy that I taught for the day is really, I try to scaffold it very much. So I start with a think aloud, with the I do, and then we move on to a you. This is where they sit with a partner and they might read. One way that they might read is popcorn style, another way they might read is orally, they might read in their head, and then they talk about the comprehension strategy and complete it together, because we know that it's really important for students to be verbal about what they're reading and the ideas off of each other. What about the title? What's the main title? What's the word? Half of the year plus, you know, the other half of the year goes with how. Is there a big topic to look at? Awesome. I was just talking with this group, and Akila said something very wise. She was able to look at the title, and then after the video, then we'll come back together and share what they thought about so that I can identify any misconceptions that they have or the way that they are thinking, so I can make sure that they're on the right track. What do you think our main topic should be here on our spoke diagram, so we can organize our thoughts? The uncontrolled water supply. And then the last part is when I let them off on their own, try to apply the strategy themselves on a level, on a test that has an appropriate level for them. My goal for today's lesson was to teach the students for the first time how to use the spoke diagram as a way to help them organize the text in their head so that they can get all of the information that they need to out of their. So I wanted them to see what I had done and then work on their own using the same kind of thought pattern to come
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to quickly shift to begin to land our flight today. It is a little bit after 6, but we're going to continue. We don't have much longer, and we'd love for you to stay with us until we land the plane and debark our flight for today. But in summary, and thank you for chatting. It was so interactive. I loved kind of engaging with all of you in the chat. But what we wanted to do was to show you in action what GRR looks like. And there's a few things I want to tag before Ms. DaVida lands our plane for today. One thing, let's look into each component of the lesson quickly. We talk about teachers leaving with a strategy or purposeful, action-oriented outcomes that you can quickly go back and turn key in your classroom. So I wanted to end my portion of our flight with some areas that you need to focus on. I want you to look at the purpose of each of the stages, the key features, the instructional strategies, and a summary of that. That'll help you with the implementation as you connect UBD and GRR. Now, let's look at I do. Here's what we saw. We saw the heavy lifting being done by the teacher. The teacher's moves. She modeled. She engaged in cognition, thinking aloud. We literally watched her. It's a beautiful thing to see. Think aloud as students were listening. They're digesting that. She said, here's what good readers do. She also allowed students to follow along and read as she models for them. So she's modeling those reading strategies aloud, and while kids are engaged, she's doing the lifting with them. She began the process of scaffolding students through questioning. Now, what were the students' academic behaviors is what I call them. And those are the moves that we see kids making in the classroom. They were listening, they were following along, they were actively reading, and there were moments where they were answering questions. Let's look at the we do. In our we do, we saw something very similar, but you saw that the teacher began to shift the learning to students. So she began to shift to guiding them to release it to them solely. And you'll see here on the screen where I've listed the key features of that. And we heard a lot of questions. She gave some cues to kind of draw them in. The teacher began to release ownership for learning to her students. She assigned some performance tasks, but ensured that kids were supported through, in this video, paired groupings or small group work. So kids are released to start owning the learning, but the teacher, we also saw her being quite active during the we do. We saw that she was listening. She would move to groups and ask questions. She would clarify, redirect thinking to make sure that they were processing the new knowledge the way that they needed to. And one of the things I love that she did is she quickly addressed everything she needed to in the phase of that part of the instruction. Oftentimes, when we don't do that, those misconceptions lock in and kids are caught into a web of trying to grapple with, I thought it was this way, but it's this way. Now, the students, what did we see them doing? They were beginning to own the lesson or own the knowledge, and they began to mirror exactly what we saw the teacher model for them. So she used graphic organizers to bring that forth. Love that. The kids were grappling with the knowledge with a peer that offered them the support. So if a kid has a misconception, maybe their peer understands it better and they can work through that gnarly phase together. We also saw kids using academic language. And I call that when they were able to use the same words we heard her use to explain, to articulate, to dialogue with the peer. And then they were also using those tools and resources that she had kind of embraced and showed them how to leverage and use. Now, what did we see in totality in the we do? We saw the teacher doing most of the heavy lifting at the beginning, and then when we got to the we do, she began to shift it back to the students, and more work is being done at the point of the student, which is the beauty of instruction. Last one, let's look at the you do together. So when we think about the you do together, the teacher was observing and pushing in as students worked independently in groups. Her work became not so much the leading and doing the heavy lifting, but now to that of supporting when and where needed or necessary, as students were now beginning to lift their own learning. The students, on the contrary, were actively working in groups. This could also be individual performance tasks at this stage of the lesson, where kids are working together, but they each have their own tool or resource, but they're able to dialogue and share. We saw kids again using similar tools. Kids were required to illustrate their understanding. That graphic organizer helped them to capture their ideas and thoughts, which is great for the teacher to see. And we saw them engaging in a concrete learning task. Now, if we go back in our minds to the National Geographic summary of GRR, that powerful visual that I urge you to study, we saw that there is, in totality, the we do portion of the lesson includes 2 components. Now, I want to tag that for you because in the video, we did not see the teacher do both parts. The video didn't show that, but I want you to be reminded that the we do it together is a powerful piece of the lesson where the teacher is pushing in, where we saw that. But there's another phase where the teacher would have we do being groups of kids or pairs working with a little bit less support from her. So I did want to tag that for you. Now, finally, what we didn't see in the lesson is the you do it alone part of the lesson. Now, it's still represented, and that's the you do it alone, where kids are doing an independent learning